Some people walk into your life like strangers until one small detail proves they were never meant to be. The restaurant glowed under warm amber lights, the kind that made everything feel softer than it really was. As Emily Carter moved between tables with quiet precision, her black apron tied neatly at her waist, her steps measured, almost invisible, like she had learned long ago how not to take up space she wasn't invited to fill, the low hum of conversation and clinking glasses surrounding her like a distant tide, steady, predictable, safe. And then the door opened, just slightly louder than usual, a shift in the air more than a sound, and heads turned, not dramatically, but enough to notice him, Daniel Whitmore, though no one said his name out loud. They didn't have to. The tailored navy suit, the effortless authority, the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but received it anyway. And Emily saw him too, just a glance at first, nothing more, the same glance she gave every guest, practiced, neutral, professional, but something in her posture stilled for half a second, something so small no one else would have caught it, not even him. As he took his seat by the window, the one overlooking the quiet Manhattan street where black cars slid past like shadows, and Emily picked up a menu, her fingers steady, her face composed, walking toward him as if this was just another table, just another order, just another night. "Good evening, sir," she said softly, her voice calm, even, the kind that didn't linger longer than necessary, placing the menu in front of him with a practiced motion, her eyes not quite meeting his. Not yet. Daniel barely looked up at first, his attention still tethered to the screen of his phone, the glow reflecting faintly in his eyes. "Sparkling water," he said, almost absently, his tone not unkind, just distant, like someone used to speaking and being heard without needing to engage, and Emily nodded once. A small, efficient gesture. "Of course," she replied, already turning, already stepping away, but as she did, something caught in her peripheral vision, just a flicker, a glint of silver beneath the restaurant lights. Subtle but precise. And her gaze shifted, just for a moment, to his wrist, where a watch rested, worn not like a statement, but like something kept close for reasons no one else needed to understand. Her steps slowed, barely, almost imperceptibly, as if her body recognized something before her mind allowed it to form. And then she looked away, quickly, too quickly, returning to the rhythm of the room. The sound of her shoes against polished wood grounding her, the tray in her hand steady, the world continuing as it always did, unchanged, undisturbed, except it wasn't, not anymore, not for her, because something about that watch, that small, insignificant detail, had already begun to unravel a thread she had spent years trying to keep tied. And across the room, Daniel Whitmore finally looked up, just for a second, watching her walk away, a faint crease forming between his brows. Not suspicion, not yet, just curiosity, quiet and unfamiliar, like the beginning of a question he didn't realize he was about to ask. Emily stood behind the service station, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the counter as she watched the bubbles rise in the tall glass of sparkling water she had just poured, small, delicate, predictable, nothing like the sudden tension that had settled quietly in her chest. And for a moment she closed her eyes, just briefly, as if resetting something inside herself, because whatever she thought she saw on that man's wrist, it could not mean anything. It could not be real, not here, not now, not after all these years. And yet her body had reacted before her thoughts could catch up. That subtle hesitation, that nearly invisible pause, the kind that only happens when something deeply buried begins to surface without permission. "Emily, table 12. A voice called from behind her, pulling her back, and she opened her eyes, steady again, composed again. The version of herself the world was allowed to see slipping back into place as easily as her apron strings. She picked up the glass and walked back toward the window table, each step measured, each breath controlled, as if nothing had shifted at all, as if she had not just felt the past brush against her like a ghost. Daniel Whitmore had set his phone down now, his attention no longer fully occupied, his gaze drifting across the room before landing on her again, not with recognition, not with familiarity, just a quiet curiosity, the kind that lingers without reason. And when she placed the glass in front of him, their eyes met for the first time. Only a second, maybe less, but enough. Enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something neither of them could name yet. "Thank you," he said, his voice lower now, more present, and Emily nodded slightly, her expression calm, her hand steady, but her eyes flickered, just once, toward his wrist again, toward the watch, the silver catching the light in that same precise way. And this time she could not look away fast enough, because the shape, the design, even the worn edge near the clasp, it was not just similar, it was exact, and a memory surfaced, uninvited, sharp and clear, a photograph she had not looked at in years, tucked away in a box she never opened, a photograph of a man she barely remembered, standing beside her mother, his arm around her shoulders, a watch on his wrist, the same watch, the same subtle scratch along the side, like a signature no one else would notice. Emily inhaled slowly, forcing her gaze back up, forcing herself to remain present. "Are you ready to order, sir?" she asked, her voice even, professional, giving nothing away, and Daniel studied her for a moment before answering, as if trying to place something just out of reach. "Not yet," he said, his tone thoughtful now, distracted in a different way. "I will need a few minutes," and she nodded again, stepping back, creating distance, because distance felt necessary, felt safe. But as she turned, his voice followed. "Wait," he said, not sharply, just enough to stop her, and she paused, her back still to him, her shoulders straight. "Yes, sir," she replied, turning slightly, careful, controlled, and for a second he seemed unsure of what he was about to say, his gaze flickering to her face, then briefly, unconsciously, to her necklace, a simple chain resting against her collarbone, barely visible beneath the collar of her shirt. And something about it made his expression shift, just slightly, a faint narrowing of his eyes, as if a detail had caught his attention without explanation. "Have we met before?" he asked finally, the question quiet, almost casual, but it landed heavier than it should have, and Emily felt it, the weight of it, the pull of something that was not supposed to exist, her fingers tightening just slightly at her side before she answered. "No, sir," she said, her voice steady, her eyes calm, giving him nothing, offering nothing. "I do not believe we have." And for a moment longer he looked at her, searching, not for an answer, but for a feeling he could not quite define, before he nodded slowly, letting it go, at least for now, and Emily turned again, walking away. But this time her steps were just a fraction faster, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel the urgency building beneath the surface. Because whatever connection he thought he sensed, whatever question, had just begun to form in his mind. She already knew one thing with absolute certainty. It was not supposed to happen like this, not in the middle of a quiet dinner shift, not because of a watch, not because of a detail that should have stayed buried. And yet, it had already begun. Emily did not return to the service station right away this time. Instead, she moved past it, past the polished counter and the low hum of her coworkers, straight toward the narrow hallway that led to the back, where the noise of the dining room softened into something distant and manageable. And only when she reached the small storage area did she stop, her hand resting lightly against the metal shelf as she exhaled slowly, deliberately, like she was trying to release something she had been holding in for years without realizing it. Because it was not just the watch, it was never just the watch, it was the way it sat on his wrist, the way he wore it without thinking, like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. And her mind pulled her backward again, not gently this time, but clearly, a kitchen table, late afternoon light, her mother sitting across from her, turning a photograph over in her hands, not saying much, never saying much, but the image had stayed, a man with calm eyes, a quiet smile, and that same watch, unmistakable, engraved on the back with words she had once traced with her fingertip as a child without understanding what they meant. And Emily straightened, her fingers curling slightly as she forced herself to focus, because memories were not facts, and coincidences happened. They had to. That was the only explanation that made sense, the only one that kept her world from shifting into something she was not ready to face. "You get back here." Mia's voice broke through gently as she stepped into the hallway, her expression curious but not intrusive, and Emily turned, offering a small nod, her composure already returning. "Just needed a second," she said, her tone light, controlled, the practiced ease of someone who knew how to redirect attention without inviting questions. Mia studied her for a moment, then shrugged slightly, accepting the answer. Table by. The window keeps looking over here, she added casually, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You must have made an impression, and Emily's gaze dropped briefly before she responded. He is just waiting to order, she said. Simple, factual, but something in her voice lacked its usual neutrality. Something softer, more uncertain, and Mia noticed, even if she did not understand it. Well, do not keep him waiting too long. He looks like the kind who is not used to that, she said with a quiet laugh before stepping back toward the dining room, leaving Emily alone again. And for a moment she did not move, her thoughts circling the same point, the same impossible connection, until finally she pushed herself forward, back into the light, back into the rhythm she knew, the restaurant unfolding around her once more as if nothing had changed, as if everything was still exactly where it belonged. Daniel Whitmore was no longer looking at his phone when she approached this time, his attention fixed entirely on her, not intense, not confrontational, just present in a way it had not been before. And as she reached the table, she noticed it again, that subtle shift in his expression, like he was trying to solve something without realizing he had already begun. Have you decided, sir? She asked, her voice steady, but softer now, less distant, and he held her gaze for a moment before answering. Yes, he said slowly, then paused, as if the order itself had become secondary. But before that, he added, leaning back slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to signal thought rather than suspicion. Your necklace, he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Emily felt her breath catch, just slightly, just enough for her body to notice before she regained control, her hand instinctively brushing the chain at her collarbone, the small pendant hidden beneath the fabric, something she had worn every day without exception, something she had never explained to anyone. It is simple, she replied carefully, her voice even, though quieter now. Nothing special, and Daniel's gaze did not leave her face. It does not look simple, he said, his tone calm, measured, but there was something else beneath it now, something closer to recognition than curiosity, and for the first time since he had walked in, Emily felt it clearly, not just the echo of the past, but the possibility that he was beginning to feel it too, not fully, not yet, but enough to make this moment heavier than it should have been, enough to turn a routine dinner service into something neither of them could walk away from unchanged. Emily did not answer right away, her fingers still resting lightly against the chain at her collarbone, as if the small piece of metal beneath the fabric had suddenly become heavier than it should have been, and for a moment the sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade again, replaced by the quiet rhythm of her own breathing, steady but deliberate, as she considered the safest way to respond without opening a door she had spent years keeping closed. It was my mother's, she said finally, her voice soft but controlled, her hand lowering slowly back to her side, and Daniel watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with a kind of focus that suggested something deeper had been stirred, something he could not yet name, but could no longer ignore. It looks familiar, he replied, almost to himself, his gaze shifting briefly away as if searching his own memory for something just out of reach, and Emily felt that same pull again, that quiet tension stretching between them, invisible but undeniable. A lot of things look familiar, she said gently, her tone neutral, offering an explanation without truly giving one. But he did not nod this time, did not let it pass so easily. Instead his eyes moved again, slower now, more deliberate, from her face to her hands, then briefly to the watch on his own wrist. And something in that motion made Emily's chest tighten just slightly, because she could see it happening, not the full realization, not yet, but the beginning of it, the way a question forms before it finds its words. Where did she get it? He asked, his voice quieter now, less like a customer and more like someone trying to piece together a story he did not know he was part of. And Emily hesitated, not long, but long enough for the silence to carry weight, her eyes dropping for just a fraction of a second before lifting again, steady, composed. She never said. She answered, and this time it was the truth, or at least the version of it she had always known, and Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling in a slow, thoughtful way. his gaze drifting toward the window where the city lights reflected faintly against the glass. But his mind was not there. It was somewhere else, somewhere in the past, somewhere that had just been. Stirred awake by a detail he could not dismiss. Strange, he murmured, almost absently. I gave something like that away once. And the words landed softly. But they did not pass unnoticed. Not for Emily, whose fingers curled slightly at her side again. The reaction small, contained, but real, because now it was no longer just her memory, it was his too, intersecting in a way that made coincidence feel less convincing by the second, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them stretching just long enough to feel intentional, before Emily stepped back, reclaiming the distance that had begun to disappear. Would you like to hear the specials, sir? She asked, her voice returning to its professional rhythm. But there was a subtle shift now, a softness that had not been there before, and Daniel looked at her again, really looked this time, as if trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the fragments of memory forming in his mind. Yes, he said after a moment. But his tone suggested the conversation was not finished, not even close. And as Emily began to speak, listing dishes with calm precision, her words flowed exactly as they should, steady and clear. But her thoughts moved elsewhere, threading together pieces she had never expected to revisit. While across the table, Daniel Whitmore listened, but not to the menu. His attention fixed instead on something far more elusive, a connection that had not yet revealed itself, but was already beginning to change the way he saw the woman standing in front of him, not as just another waitress. Not anymore. Emily finished listing the specials with the same steady cadence she had used hundreds of times before, her voice calm, measured, each word placed carefully as if routine alone could hold everything in place. And when she stopped, the silence that followed felt different from any other table she had served that night. Heavier, more aware, as though something unseen had settled between them and refused to leave. Daniel did not respond immediately, his gaze still resting on her, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that quietly held it, as if he were studying not just what she said, but everything she was not saying. I will have the grilled salmon, he said finally, his tone even, but distant, like part of him was elsewhere, still turning over a thought he could not quite complete. And a side of roasted vegetables. Emily nodded once, her pen moving smoothly across the small notepad in her hand, the familiar motion grounding her, giving her something certain to hold on to. Of course, she replied, and for a brief second it almost felt normal again, almost like the moment had passed, but then he added, Emily, and her name sounded different coming from him, not incorrect, not unfamiliar, just unexpected, enough to make her look up again. Yes, sir, she answered, her voice steady, though something inside her shifted slightly at the sound of it, and he hesitated, just long enough to suggest that whatever he was about to say had not been part of any plan. How long have you worked here? He asked, the question simple, almost casual, but the way he asked it carried something else beneath the surface, something closer to intention than curiosity, and Emily felt it, the direction this was moving, the subtle narrowing of distance that had nothing to do with the physical space between them. A few years, she said, keeping her answer brief, controlled, offering only what was necessary, and Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that, but not satisfied by it. And before that, he continued, his voice still calm, but more focused now, like someone tracing a line they had just discovered, and Emily's grip on the pen tightened just slightly before she responded. Different places, she said, her tone light, almost dismissive, but not quite enough to end the question. And he noticed, of course he noticed, because people like him always notice the details others overlooked, the pauses, the deflections, the careful choice of words. You are very precise, he said quietly, not as a compliment, not as a critique, just an observation, and Emily felt a faint, almost imperceptible tension move through her shoulders before she straightened, meeting his gaze again. It is part of the job, she replied, and for a moment something in his expression softened, just slightly, as if he recognized something in that answer, something beyond the surface of it. No, he said, almost under his breath, it is not just the job, and the words lingered, subtle but deliberate, and Emily did not respond, because she did not need to. because silence sometimes said more than anything she could have offered. And as she stepped back again, preparing to leave the table, his eyes followed her movement once more, but this time there was no confusion in them, no vague curiosity, only a growing sense that something important was unfolding, something he had not expected to find in a quiet restaurant on an ordinary evening, while Emily walked away with the same composed rhythm she always carried. But inside, the pieces were no longer still, they were shifting, aligning, moving toward a truth she had spent years avoiding, and for the first time, she was no longer sure she wanted to keep avoiding it. The kitchen doors swung open with a soft push as Emily stepped inside. The warmth of the dining room replaced by the sharper rhythm of clattering pans and low voices calling orders. But even here, surrounded by movement and noise, her thoughts refused to settle. They kept circling back to the same point, the same man, the same watch, the same impossible overlap of past and present that no longer felt like coincidence. She placed the order ticket on the counter with steady hands, her voice calm, as she called it out. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying every word he had said, every glance he had given, every detail he had noticed. And what unsettled her most was not that he was asking questions, it was that he was asking the right ones without knowing why. "You are quiet tonight," the chef remarked without looking up, his tone casual, observational, and Emily forced a small smile. "Just focused," she replied. Simple, believable, and he nodded, already moving on, because in a place like this, no one had time to linger on anything for too long. Except she did. She could feel it building now, that quiet pressure beneath the surface, the sense that something long buried was beginning to rise whether she wanted it to or not. And as she waited for the plate to be ready, her hand moved almost unconsciously to her necklace again, her fingers brushing the small pendant hidden beneath the fabric. And this time she did not stop herself. She pulled it out slightly, just enough to see it, a small, worn piece of metal, simple at first glance, but engraved on the back with words she had memorized without ever fully understanding. Words her mother had never explained, words that had always felt like a fragment of a story she was not meant to know. And for a moment she just stared at it, the kitchen lights reflecting faintly off its surface, her breath slow, controlled, until the chef's voice broke through again. "Order up." And she blinked, slipping the pendant back into place. The moment gone, but not forgotten, as she picked up the plate and turned back toward the dining room. The doors opening once more to that familiar glow, that steady hum, that illusion of normalcy that now felt thinner than before. Daniel Whitmore was exactly where she had left him, but he was not the same. Something in his posture had shifted, less distant now, more present, as if the conversation they had begun had not ended, only paused. And when she approached, setting the plate down carefully in front of him, their eyes met again, longer this time, more deliberate. "Your salmon, sir," she said, her voice soft, steady, and he glanced at the plate briefly before looking back at her, as though the meal itself was no longer the reason he was there. "Thank you," he replied, but his tone carried something else now, something closer to certainty than curiosity. And for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them filled with everything that had not yet been said, until he spoke again, quieter this time. "That engraving," he said, his gaze flickering toward her collar, not intrusive, just aware. "Does it have words on it?" And Emily felt it again, that subtle tightening in her chest. Not fear, not exactly, but something deeper, something that came from standing too close to a truth that could no longer be ignored. And this time, she did not deflect immediately. She did not step away. Instead, she held his gaze for a second longer than before, just enough to acknowledge what was happening between them, before she answered. "Yes," she said, her voice calm, but softer now. "It does." And Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that suggested recognition, not complete, not fully formed, but enough to change everything about this moment, enough to turn a simple dinner into something neither of them could walk away from unchanged. And as Emily stood there, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider until now. This was no longer just about what she knew. It was about what he was beginning to remember. Daniel did not look down at his food, not yet, his attention still fixed on Emily, as if the answer she had just given had shifted something deeper than either of them expected. And for a moment he said nothing, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, his other hand unconsciously adjusting the watch on his wrist, a small, habitual motion that carried more meaning now than it ever had before. "What does it say?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but unmistakably focused, no longer casual, no longer detached. And Emily felt the weight of the question settle between them, heavier than any before it, because this was not just curiosity anymore. This was a step closer to something neither of them could undo. Her eyes held his for a brief second before dropping, not out of submission, but out of careful control, as if she needed that moment to decide how much of the truth she was willing to let into the open. Her fingers moved again to the chain at her collarbone, slower this time, deliberate, and without rushing. She pulled the pendant free, letting it rest in her palm, where the light could catch it, where it could be seen, really seen, not hidden, not softened by distance. And she turned it slightly, just enough for the engraving to face him, but she did not hand it over, not yet. "It says," she began, her voice softer now, quieter than before, but clear, each word placed with intention, "always come back to us." And the moment the words left her lips, something in Daniel's expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from across the room, but unmistakably. His gaze sharpened, his posture stilled, and for the first time since he had walked in, he looked at her not as a stranger, not as a server, but as someone connected to a memory he could no longer ignore. "That is not possible," he murmured, almost to himself, his eyes flickering between the pendant and her face, searching, aligning, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew. And Emily did not interrupt, did not fill the silence, because she could see it happening now, the realization building slowly, piece by piece, the way truth often does when it has been buried for too long. "I had that engraved," he said after a moment, his voice lower, more certain, as if saying it out loud made it real in a way he had not allowed before. And Emily felt her breath catch, just slightly, not from surprise, because she had already known, deep down, but from the finality of hearing it confirmed. "For someone," he continued, his gaze drifting briefly away, as if the memory itself required space to surface, a long time ago. And when he looked back at her, there was no confusion left, only a question that carried more weight than anything he had asked before. "How did you get that?" And this time, Emily did not look away. She did not step back. Instead, she held his gaze, steady, calm, but no longer distant, because distance was no longer possible. Not after this, not after the line that had just been crossed. "It was given to my mother," she said, her voice even, but softer now, more personal, more real, and Daniel's expression tightened just slightly. Not with anger, not with disbelief, but with the quiet impact of something falling into place, something he had not expected to find in a moment like this, in a place like this. "Your mother," he repeated, as if testing the words, as if measuring their weight. And Emily nodded once, a small, simple gesture, but one that carried everything she was not yet saying, everything she had held back for years. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was charged, filled with the understanding that whatever this was, whatever connection had just revealed itself through a small piece of metal and a few engraved words, it was real, and it was only just beginning. Daniel did not speak immediately after her answer, the words settling into the space between them with a quiet weight that neither of them could ignore. His gaze remained fixed on her, but it was no longer searching, no longer uncertain. It was remembering, slowly, carefully, as if each detail needed to be handled with precision to avoid breaking something fragile. "What was her name?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the distance it had carried before. And Emily felt the shift in that question, not just curiosity, but intent, real and undeniable. Her fingers closed gently around the pendant before she let it fall back against her chest, hidden again but no less present. "Claire," she said, her voice steady, but softer than before. And the moment the name left her lips, something in Daniel's expression changed again, more visibly this time, his eyes narrowing slightly as recognition moved from possibility into something far more certain. "Claire," he repeated, almost under his breath, as if the name itself carried a memory he had not allowed himself to revisit in years. And for a moment he looked away, his gaze drifting toward the window. But he was not seeing the street outside. He was seeing something else entirely, something from a different time, a different version of himself. And when he looked back at her, the distance that had defined him when he first sat down was gone, replaced by something quieter, more human. She had a small apartment near the waterfront, he said slowly, not as a question, but as a recollection, each word measured, careful, as if testing the reality of what he was remembering. And Emily nodded once, the motion subtle but undeniable. Yes, she replied, and that single confirmation seemed to settle something deeper inside him, something that had been unresolved for far too long. And she used to leave the window open, even in the winter. He continued, his voice softer now, almost distant, like he was speaking more to the memory than to her. And Emily felt a tightness in her chest that she could not fully suppress. Because she remembered that too, not from her own experience, but from the stories her mother had told, the small, quiet details that had once seemed insignificant but now felt like pieces of something much larger. She said it made the place feel less empty. Emily added before she could stop herself, her voice barely above a whisper, and Daniel's eyes snapped back to hers. The connection between memory and reality closing in an instant. You know that, he said, not as a question, but as a realization. And this time, Emily did not step back. She did not retreat into the safety of distance. Instead, she held his gaze, calm but unwavering. She told me, she said, simple, direct, and the silence that followed was different from any before it. It was no longer uncertain, no longer tentative. It was filled with understanding, with the quiet acknowledgement that the truth they were circling had already begun to take shape, even if neither of them had fully said it out loud yet. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand moving to his watch again, his thumb brushing lightly over its surface as if grounding himself in something familiar, something constant. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. Claire never told me she had a child, he said, and the words were not accusatory, not defensive, just honest. And Emily felt them settle, not as a contradiction, but as a missing piece she would not have. She replied quietly, her tone steady but firm. She said some things were not meant to be explained, and Daniel studied her for a long moment after that, his gaze steady, thoughtful, and something in his expression shifted again, not confusion, not doubt, but acceptance, slow and deliberate, like a door opening not all at once, but inch by inch. And for the first time since this conversation began, neither of them seemed to be searching anymore, because the truth was no longer something hidden. It was something unfolding, right in front of them, in the quiet space between a man who had walked in as a stranger and a woman who had served him like any other guest, until a single detail had changed everything. Daniel did not move for a long moment after her last words, his hand still resting lightly over the watch, his thumb no longer tracing its surface but pressing against it, as if holding on to something that had suddenly become real in a way he could not ignore. And the restaurant continued around them, quiet conversations, soft laughter, the distant clink of silverware against plates, all of it carrying on as if nothing had changed. But at their table, everything had shifted, everything had narrowed into this single moment that neither of them had planned. "What is your name?" he asked finally, though he already knew, though he had heard it before. The question was not about information, it was about confirmation, about grounding. Something that felt too significant to remain unspoken, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation this time, her posture steady, her expression calm but no longer distant. "Emily Carter," she said, her voice clear, each word deliberate, and something in Daniel's face tightened just slightly at the last name. Not confusion, not rejection, just the quiet impact of recognition finding its place. "Carter," he repeated, softer now, as if testing the sound of it against his own memory, and for a moment he looked down, not at his food, but at the table, at the small, ordinary details that suddenly felt inadequate for what he was trying to process. "She changed it," he said under his breath, more to himself than to her, and Emily did not correct him, did not explain, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to explain that would make this easier or clearer. The truth was already there, unfolding between them without needing to be forced, and when he looked back up, his eyes were different, not because they had changed, but because what he saw had. How old are you? He asked, the question simple, but the answer carrying more weight than anything that had come before, and Emily hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because this was the moment where the line between possibility and reality would close, where the last space for doubt would disappear. 26, she said, her voice quiet but steady, and Daniel inhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, but heavier than it should have been, because the number aligned. It fit into the space his memory had left open. It completed something he had not known was incomplete until now. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but full, complete in a way that words could not improve. And then, very slowly, Daniel leaned back in his chair, not to distance himself, but to take in the reality of what was in front of him, his gaze never leaving her. I did not know, he said finally, his voice low, not defensive, not apologetic, just honest. And Emily nodded once, a small, understanding gesture. I know, she replied, her tone calm, without accusation, without expectation, and that was what settled it, not the facts, not the details, but the absence of blame, the quiet acceptance of something that had not been planned, had not been chosen, but had still led them here, to this table, to this moment. And Daniel exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders easing just slightly as something inside him shifted, not resolved, not fixed, but acknowledged. I do not know what to say, he admitted, and Emily's expression softened just enough to be seen, just enough to change the space between them. You do not have to say anything, she said gently,